Okay. So before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Darug Nation on whose lands we gather on today, and recognise that this land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also would like to thank Queer Theory Reading Group for having me here and allowing me to present today and for holding this conference to discuss queer voices and absences. So, first thought to be a gay disease that only affects homosexual men, the HIV/AIDS epidemic of the 80s and 90s is now recognised as a monumental moment for both the LGBTQ+ community and the wider heterosexual public. Officially reported on in Australia in 1982, the Australian federal government's response to the virus is considered to be the world's best when it comes to global responses to the epidemic. However, discussions of this reaction to HIV/AIDS has heavily focused on the success of white non-Indigenous peoples, ignoring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led campaigns that have been equally or even more successful in lowering the number of positive diagnoses and educating communities about the virus. In presenting this paper, I aim to use the privileged platform that I have as a non-Indigenous queer cis man to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander HIV/AIDS responses to the forefront of discussions of the epidemic in Australia. Within this paper, I draw upon Indigenous scholarship that discusses the crisis, as well as 3 First Nations HIV/AIDS campaigns to highlight how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have created these campaigns as a reaction to the silencing of their identities within the Australian response, while also creating campaigns that were both culturally aware and empowering. To do this, I will first provide an overview of HIV/AIDS in Australia before discussing the ways in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples went about creating their own responses to the crisis. I will then finish off with a discussion of 3 Indigenous-led responses to the virus: the 1987 Condo Man campaign, the 1994 Amwakana conference, and the most recent You and Me Can Stop HIV campaign. Okay. HIV/AIDS in Australia. The narrative HIV/AIDS, or human immunodeficiency virus and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, as it referred to at the time, often begins in Turtle Island, also known as the United States, in July 1981. American health professionals were the first to report on a number of young, previously healthy homosexual men who had died from illnesses or a form of gay cancer, rarely seen in this demographic. After the discovery of the virus, news media took the emergence of this new virus to the public, with headlines reading, "Mystery Gay Disease Hits Here," AIDS, the killer disease that expected to sweep Australia, gay community responds to threat of mystery disease, forging a link between the virus and homosexuality. In Australia, at a time where homosexuality was viewed as both socially immoral and illegal in many states, reactions differed. The public and media often focused on the deviance of the gay community, with a number of medical researchers, mainstream journalists, and conservative social commentators associating the lifestyle of homosexual men with the causes of HIV/AIDS, ultimately blaming the gays for the emergence of the virus. However, despite these views and also other anti-gay conservative peoples who believed that the virus was the will of God, the inevitable result of greater increased social acceptance of male homosexuality, the Australian government acted swiftly, working with high-risk groups such as gay men, sex workers, and IV drug users to establish its response to HIV/AIDS. Within this response, a key tenet was the introduction of the Grim Reaper campaign, which included a series of advertising materials as well as the infamous Grim Reaper advertisement that flashed on television screens across the country in 1987. Anyone with living memory of the 80s in Australia will mostly remember this advertisement that shocked Australia to its core. They may well even have flashbacks to the image of the Grim Reaper bowling down a row of innocent victims with that dark, raspy voiceover proclaiming that AIDS could kill more Australians in World War II. However, despite the general consensus amongst politicians and other affluent members of the public who considered that the campaign was successful in reducing positive HIV/AIDS diagnoses, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples criticised this response, highlighting that it did nothing to empower Indigenous peoples to take control of their own sexual health. At the same time, the threat of the virus continued to have significant impacts upon these Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander LGBTQ+ peoples and the wider Indigenous community. Due to increased homophobia and stigmatisation, many people living with Indigenous people living with HIV/AIDS who were often homosexual men were banished from their communities, forced to live in isolation, and often died from AIDS complications alone and in shame. For most HIV-positive First Nations peoples, the virus often was a frightening experience. Many had the attitude of fuck the world soon after a positive diagnosis, often viewing AIDS as an incurable disease that resulted in death. Further, First Nations communities not only thought of HIV/AIDS as a gay illness, but also believed that the virus was another white man's disease. In reaction to these perceptions, Indigenous Australian-led responses to the virus spoke to these issues, aiming to empower communities to take leadership of their own sexual health, while also highlighting how the virus can affect anyone who engages in unsafe sexual and other behaviours, not just homosexual men. With little being done to empower communities during the height of the crisis in the late 1980s, early 1990s, Indigenous homosexual men, sex workers, and IV drug users, alongside those living with HIV/AIDS, started to take responsibility into their own hands. These high-risk groups, as well as Indigenous health workers, established organisations that were tasked with not only limiting the spread, but also educating their communities about the virus and safe sex practices. In Australia, these HIV/AIDS organisations were established predominantly by HIV-positive gay men who wanted to reclaim their sexuality and empower their communities. Many of these men consider themselves to be an invisible group, priority group within Australia's response. The establishment of these queer Indigenous-led organisations in particular were crucial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples living with HIV/AIDS and wider First Nations communities during the epidemic. I'll now highlight 3 First Nations-led responses to HIV/AIDS in Australia, all of which are still continuing to do important work with and in communities today. Introduced in 1987, Condo Man is often considered to be the first major HIV/AIDS campaign developed for and by Indigenous Australian communities. As previously mentioned, the Australian government's infamous 1987 campaign highlighted that nothing was being done to empower Indigenous communities to take control of their own sexual health. This is where Condo Man steps in. Armed with a powerful contraception tool, a condom, as well as cultural recognition and empowerment, Condo Man urges Indigenous peoples to not feel ashamed of their HIV status and sexual health practices, but to be game when it comes to safe sex. Developed by Beery Aboriginal sexual health worker Arnie Graceland Smallwood, together with a group of Indigenous sexual health workers in Townsville, Condo Man has quickly become an iconic figure for sexual health and the prevention of HIV/AIDS within Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. In 2009, Condo Man was relaunched with support by Queensland Health and the Queensland Aboriginal and Islander Health Council, releasing a range of resources that included keyrings, comics, books, posters, and of course condom packs. Condo Man, with his new partner in crime, Lubalicious, continues to reach new generations of Indigenous Australian peoples today and remains an effective response to HIV/AIDS and other sexual health issues. With homophobia and stigmatisation surrounding HIV/AIDS rising in Indigenous communities, an openly group of Aboriginal men established a support network in the 1980s, later holding the first national Aboriginal HIV/AIDS conference in 1992. During the succeeding years, the group secured government funding to develop a national forum that was aimed at addressing the impact of HIV/AIDS within Indigenous Australian communities, giving space for these communities to discuss how best to respond to the crisis. Shortly after this, a national steering committee was established and the first Amwakana conference, meaning Us Mob in Arenta, was held in Alice Springs during the later half of 1994. The conference not only represented a long-term commitment to raising HIV/AIDS awareness, but a group of dedicated young Aboriginal gay men. It also recognised that HIV/AIDS was a major health threat to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. However, while its establishment successfully mobilised a First Nations-led response to HIV/AIDS, in 2010 the conference funding dried up, with the organising committee having to face the real possibility of ceasing the event. Nevertheless, the conference board, in partnership with the Australian Federation of AIDS Organisations, successfully secured a grant which was used to continue the conference, which held its 5th meeting in 2011. Today, Amwakana represents an important milestone in the mobilisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to come together and raise awareness about HIV/AIDS. Established by the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation in 2021, as part of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander HIV Awareness Week, You and Me Can Stop HIV has empowered Indigenous communities to prevent a rise in HIV diagnoses. The main message behind the campaign is that Indigenous communities need to come together and be there for each other to look out and care for not only HIV-positive peoples, but rather the whole community. The UN Me Can Stop HIV campaign includes community events, accessible educational videos, and other materials that allow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to learn about HIV prevention in a way that is culturally aware, inclusive, and empowering. So since its emergence in the 1980s, HIV/AIDS and the subsequent Australian response has become to be recognised as a pivotal moment that has affected the whole Australian public, not just the queer community. However, while the Australian response to the virus is internationally recognised as one of the best, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander responses to the crisis have been overlooked, often cast in the shadow of this wider Australian response. Facing increased homophobia and stigmatisation, Indigenous Australian peoples sought out to create their own campaigns to answer this growing number of positive diagnoses and stigmatisations within First Nations communities. As we continue to reflect on the history of HIV/AIDS in Australia, we must bring these silenced voices to the forefront of discussions of the epidemic. We must shed light on the responses and campaigns created by and for Indigenous Australian communities, as well as highlighting the resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that continues today. And there's some references.